A quick flash poll in the audience. Who among you has a mobile office and no longer has a brick and mortar office here? How many? About a quarter. Okay. Well, it doesn't matter if you're a cyber commuter or if you're tied to a brick and mortar office. It doesn't matter. Our next keynote speaker is here to tell us why the new way to work is becoming top of the agenda for many managers. Please help me welcome to the stage the CEO of Unify, Mr. Dean Douglas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good morning. Guten Tag. We're going to talk this morning
Today, work depends on collaboration. But work doesn't happen where it used to, when it used to. Sometimes it happens with a team you never met, or a customer you never shook hands with. But all this change shouldn't change a thing. Reach out to a customer. Put an idea on the table. A face to a name. Share great ideas. Connect. Today, work is just like it used to be, only better, richer, more collaborative. It's new. Welcome to the new way to work. Welcome to a unified world.
So this morning we're going to talk about a new way to work. And as you can see from the video, there's a lot of different kinds of technology being deployed in the world today. And each one of those different types of technologies are creating different dialogues or different conversations that are causing us to look at the world and, in fact, interact with the world and each other in very, very different ways. And this is happening today. It's not something that's going to happen 5 years from now or 10 years from now. It's an issue and a challenge we have got to face today. And as we look at this consumerization of IT and the way in which we communicate, we really find that what we've got to do is we've got to begin to start to embrace what is happening in the marketplace from a consumer standpoint as opposed to fighting it. For so long, our IT organizations, our managers, myself, have said, well, the consumerization of IT is really not something we need to embrace because they're not as reliable from a communication standpoint, or those technologies are not as robust. And as a result, in an enterprise world, the kinds of communications that we see in that consumer world are just not going to cut it with our employees and what they expect out of us in terms of the IT we provide, or for that matter, the communications facilities we give them. But that's not true. The fact is that our employees are becoming very, very comfortable with the way in which they interact with each other, with the web, with other sources, because of the way in which they can get comfortable with these products that they use in their own home. And so as a result, we really need to think about this nexus of forces, this amazing amount of technology that's coming at us with very, very different platforms. There's the mobile platform, there's information that's coming to us from a number of different sources. Of course, there's the cloud and how we interact with the cloud. We all interact with the cloud one way or another every day. And then, of course, there's social networking. And whether it's business-related social networking like LinkedIn, or it's Facebook or Twitter, which sort of is a hybrid, the fact is we're doing a lot of that across our organizations. And our IT organizations and our communications organizations need to understand that the dialogues, the communications, the conversations that we're having take place in a mobile world, take place in a very information-rich world. They take place across a number of technologies, whether it's in the office, through the cloud, or other technology capability. And it's done in a way that blends that business and personal communications aspects. On top of that, there's a whole different perspective coming along that is really beginning to start to make us think about the world in a different context. And that different context is the way in which we communicate in a pervasive way. So let's talk about pervasive computing. The fact is, pervasive computing is not just communications or dialogues in a number of different places. Yes, that's one aspect of it. But pervasive computing is also what we're starting to call the Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things is a way in which we now begin to start to communicate machine to machine and people to machine, but it's all electronic. And so as a result, we're finding ourselves having a lot more opportunity for information and communications with devices or sources of information, pools of information that we haven't had before. And bringing together that Internet of Things and the data it provides in a way in which we can utilize it to go forward and have more robust dialogues is important. We've got to start to find a way to embrace that, because the information is going to be there, the capabilities are going to be there, and if we ignore this opportunity, then we're going to find ourselves well behind from an institutional standpoint, from an enterprise standpoint, in the way in which we interact with ourselves as well as with these machines. The fact is that this show is about big data. This year, that's the theme. And big data really starts with a lot of this pervasive computing. We've really got to think about how we address that. And how do we begin to create dialogues, that communications that exists between ourselves as human beings and other areas of data, not just voice, but real data, and go forward with that. But enough with that. Let's talk about the millennials. So we've got this issue going on with technology, and we talked about that, the pervasiveness of technology and data, machine to machine and all that. And then we've got this incredible variable out there called millennials. And the millennials are those folks that have been born since 1981. And they have a whole different world that they're addressing. They've got a very, very different way of communicating with each other. They've got a very, very different way of having conversations. And so when you think about millennials, you really begin to start to think about a very, very disruptive set of attributes. And what do I mean by that? Well, 29% of millennials prefer to use email as a way of communicating. That means 71% of millennials do not want to use email as a way of communicating. And remember, these folks represent a large part of our population today. They're sort of the early 30-somethings. By the end of the decade, they're going to be over 50% of the workforce. And they don't like using email. In contrast with baby boomers, of which I'm one, you know, we're very comfortable with email. 45% of baby boomers like using email as a preferred way of communicating. It's not the way with millennials. They like to blog. And in fact, 40% of millennials have a blog and blog on a regular basis. The problem is when they blog, they're not looking at the same kinds of social conventions or rules that we have in our organizations. So we set up all of these rules about interaction with social media. Millennials don't care. They're going to communicate the way they want to communicate. And we've got to begin to think about that. We've got to start moving along the path to embrace that and, in fact, leverage that, because there's a lot of power and there's a lot of opportunity, productivity that can be garnered by embracing that and understanding how they communicate and how they really do want to interact, because they're going to be a large part of the workforce, not only today but into the near future. What we're also seeing is that virtual teams are taking over. Once again, this is not necessarily technology, but it's technology driven. And we've got to think about these virtual teams. You know, last year, several hundred million people joined into these virtual teams, and this year we think another 300 million will join virtual teams. Virtual teams are defined as folks that operate out of teams that operate out of multiple locations. So when you start thinking about these virtual teams, you start to get underneath and understand a number of different attributes about them that I think are important. So what have we learned about virtual teams? Well, we went out and we queried 1,600 users. In fact, had interviews with 70 C-level executives to talk with them about these virtual teams and what did they want out of the virtual teams. And what they found was that virtual teams tend to be a lot more productive. So the good news is they're more productive. They are a way of creating an environment where people can work at home or they can work in multiple offices and yet still be productive. In fact, in our North American organization, we just brought on board a new general manager for North America, and he was trying to figure out where he should move in order to be with his team. He's got 8 directs. In each one of those directs, is in a different city in North America. And so as a result, there's no nexus, there's no place where they all work together. And he had to find a way to communicate with all of these executives across the entirety of the United States. Monolithic culturally, but diverse geographically. And as a result, he really began to start thinking about this whole idea of virtual teams and what is going on with virtual teams and how does he create the right kind of dynamic with his virtual teams. The problem with virtual teams, however, is that while 79% of the employees work in virtual teams, they tend to be very distracted at meetings. You know, if it's a voice meeting, especially a voice call, people are doing other things. They're playing with the kids, they're petting the dog, they're making breakfast, whatever they're doing, but they're not focused on the call. And so as a result, they're finding that these meetings are very unproductive. And in fact, the statistics indicate that 56% of these meetings are not productive. And you can see that. You know, how many times have you been on the call and you'll ask a question and there's a long pause and then the person who obviously missed the context of the question and the person that's supposed to answer the question comes back and says, "Oh, I was on mute. Would you mind repeating that question again?" Well, they've put the dog away and they've done whatever they need to do and now they're back into the conversation. And we all know that happens. And so there's got to be a way to start thinking about how we create the right kind of environment around our work environment, the way in which we interact, as opposed to the orchestration, the meeting process. And find a way to work much more collaboratively together. Noise from technology. Boy, is that the truth. There's so much technology out there. There's so much diversity that in a lot of ways it can be very, very distracting. And in many organizations, Unify was one of them, we had all kinds of rules about the different types of technology that we would utilize and we would embrace, or for that matter, our IT organization would support. You know, only certain types of PCs, and they had to be PCs, only certain types of phones, in fact, only certain types of service providers. But we've changed that. And so people have Apples as well as PCs. People have different types of PCs. People have different technology platforms they utilize. People within Unify use all kinds of different devices. And we tie them together. Other organizations need to find a way to do the exact same thing. Find a way to tie together all of these different disparate technologies, because otherwise it's just going to be distracting. People are going to try and find a way to get around the technology constraints that an organization puts on its folks, and that can be very, very distracting. Communications technologies really do need to be collaborative. They really do need to have a way of bringing together a number of different disparate information types or conversations. And you know, conversations are not just voice anymore, right? It's email, it's blogging, it's social media. Conversations are any one of a number of different interactions. And those conversations really need to be done in a very, very different way. We've got to find a way as organizations to embrace what happens on the consumer side, where people are doing texting, and they're doing video, and they're doing email, and they're doing shopping, which of course we'd never allow at work, and all kinds of other things going on. We've got to be able to make these technologies work together. And it's not just tying them together in some back office platform, a server. They've got to come together seamlessly on a single pane of glass, because people are having dialogues or conversations that are multimodal. And those multimodal conversations, video, data inputs, email, voice, all have to work together, because that's what people are trying to do at home, and that's what they need to do to be productive at work. It used to be when you had informal networks, that was because you had a very, very politically savvy player within an organization. It was all about politics. But today, informal networks are not about politics, they're the way things get done. When you think about virtual teams, because people are so scattered, you really need to have these informal networks working together collaboratively in order to get work done, in order to execute the plans that came about in these meetings. And informal networks are a very, very powerful tool that organizations need to cultivate more and find ways to facilitate more of, because these informal networks are the way in which business is going to be done going forward. But with all of this, we still need to have that visual context. So one thing I haven't talked a whole lot about is video. But the fact is that as we bring together these teams, we've got to find a way to have that face time as well. That face time is very, very important. We're social animals, and we really need to be able to interact in a way in which we can look at each other and determine just exactly what's going on, facial expressions, lack of interest, denial, whatever it is. We just need to be able to have that conversation include the visual element. But we can't do it face-to-face in a person-to-person environment. We've got to use different types of media in order to facilitate that face-to-face communications that exist for the Anywhere worker. So what we've done is we've gone out and we've queried a number of different sources of information around this new way to work. What are the dynamics and how are they going forward? And we're doing our own research on how we create this new way of working. And so we've created the Unify Work Index, and we'll be updating this work index, which will give you all some insight into what's happening, the trends that are going on today in the world of communication as companies are trying to address these challenges, technology, people, work habits, and the like, in order to address much more efficiently the way in which they drive their virtual teams. So let's talk about attributes of virtual teams. You know, when you think about virtual teams today, 70% of the virtual teams have more than half their team in multiple locations. So I gave you an extreme example of our organization in North America, but the fact is that the preponderance of these virtual teams have their folks in multiple locations. And so that's a reality, and we've got to find a way to address that reality in a much more productive way. One of the worst things, and I know we've all experienced this, one of the worst things about being on a conference call is when someone decides to hijack the call. It's bad enough when they try and hijack a meeting, but you can usually shut them down or get them off stage or whatever. But when they're on the call, you know what happens. All the calls go on mute, and people start doing email or any one of a number of other things. And all of a sudden, the emails start coming in. You could just see it happening because they're not listening anymore. The fact is that co-innovation, that is real dialogues working together on these calls as people are having these conversations, needs to take place. And as you continue to promote co-innovation on these calls, in these communications vehicles, you find yourself with a much more robust, much more capable virtual team, underscored team. And that's very, very important. Another attribute of virtual teams that I think is very, very important is business is personal. The fact is that with millennials, that's gone. There's no distinction between business and personal life. It's all there. It's all one level. It's all one plane. For many of us, I started working a few years ago, and when I started working, you hopped in a car, you drove to your office, you went in, you sat in your cubicle. In fact, back then they didn't even have cubicles, and you sat at your desk and you worked. And if you happened to be in sales, which I was, then you had a very, very different world because you could actually say, oh, I'm going to see a customer. And you'd get up and you'd leave the office. You actually could leave the office. And you might go get your car washed. You might go to the dentist. You might go do some other things. Of course, you'd go see customers. But in that world, it was very, very different because there was still a way, an empirical way, of measuring whether I was productive or not. And that is, did I meet my sales quotas? If If I met my sales quotas, then I could go to the dentist all I wanted or do whatever I needed to do. But if I wasn't meeting my sales quota, I better be out there making sales calls, because otherwise I was going to lose my job. But today, everybody has that freedom. And so we've got to find a way to understand, appreciate, and for that matter, take advantage of that environment in order to allow our employees to be much more productive, even in that context of business and personal sort of being on the same line, because everybody's got that freedom today. So what do? How do you address this? How do you really take advantage of creating an environment that allows you to have the right kind of virtual teams and have those virtual teams have the right kinds of conversations, so at the end of the day, you've garnered some real productivity improvement? Well, first, you really need to assess what your employees want to do. How do they want to communicate? Let me give you an example of what was done at the University of Michigan. The University of Michigan, and they did this about 35 years ago, they re-landscaped the campus. And as they re-landscaped the campus, they were trying to figure out where to put the sidewalks. And what they decided to do is to just lay the grass down, and they did not put any sidewalks in. And they watched to see how people went from building to building to building. And then based upon those paths that were created, they laid down the sidewalks. And there's an important lesson to be learned there. We need to do the same thing with our employees. We need to talk with them and ask them, how do they want to engage? How do they want to interact? How do they want to manage their virtual teams? And with that insight and that information, we can put the right kinds of technology in place to address the challenge that we've got associated with these new technologies and personalities that are going to be our workers in the future. The second is that instead of fighting the consumer world and consumer technology and saying, oh, well, you know, that's not available and that's not reliable, we've got to embrace it. We've got to look at it and say, what's going on in the consumer world, what's going on in the technology world that our employees really like, and see what we can do to bring it into our enterprises. Now, of course, it's got to be robust, it's got to be available, and it's got to be reliable, because our employees are going to have an unreasonable expectation of what we can provide as an enterprise. But having said that, we've got to embrace what's going on in the consumer world, because that is the metric that our end users, our employees, are looking for when they come to work, and they expect to see that. And if they don't, they're going to stay at home and they're going to use other vehicles to get work done that you're just not going to be able to manage effectively. And so we really need to create that flexibility within the way in which we deploy our communications infrastructure, be it IT or other types of communications, including voice, so that we address the requirements of a very consumer-driven end user community. And then we've really got to embrace a new way to work. The old paradigms just do not work. And we've really got to be thinking about the fact that we are going through a very fundamental shift in the way in which people work. And I'll give you an example, a real-world example that I was involved in personally that occurred about a decade ago. So in 2002, I had the opportunity to meet with the senior management team of Kodak. I was with IBM Global Services at the time. Kodak, massive industrial powerhouse in North America, an innovator, a true giant from a brand perspective, as well as a giant from an underlying technology perspective. And in 2002, we met, and we'd been talking about this idea, this concept that I had of taking a camera and putting a phone in it. And I know you all laugh today, but back then it was a very innovative idea. And at first they thought that it was too far out there, that people wouldn't embrace what they called transient images. People wouldn't embrace the camera with low megapixels, taking pictures and sending them to folks. And so they really didn't think that a camera with a phone inside was the right model for them. But by the end of the year, they realized that the marketplace was moving that way, and it might be a good product for them to sell. And so we got together and they said, yes, by 2005, we're going to have we're going to have a camera out there that's got a phone. 2005. And we see what happened to Kodak today. And it was amazing. From 2002, this industrial powerhouse, to 2005, they never got the device out there. And the company's obviously gone through receivership today. And what are they today? They're a paper company. And by the way, an also-ran paper company. And so you think about that technology shift. Well, I don't think that the technology shift that we're going through right now is any different. It's a true watershed. And what we've got to do is we've got to embrace it. Because otherwise, our employees will continue to embrace it. They'll move forward with or without us. And we'll lose control of those end users and the way in which they communicate. Because their executives, their managers are going to find ways to have those conversations and to communicate, whether the IT organization, the communications organizations within our companies embrace it or not. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to find a way to embrace this. So this is our website. This is where you can find information about our index. I would ask you to take a look at it from time to time and see what we've got out there, the new data that we provide, and some of the insights. And of course, we'd be happy to talk with you further about some of those insights. The fact is, we're seeing a fundamental shift. Let's not forget that. And let's begin to start to embrace it, because fundamental shifts can actually be very, very powerful, and they can be tremendous enhancements to organizations that do embrace those shifts. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
We got time for one question.
Okay, sure.
We had a tweet that came in, and if companies are saving money, we assume, because there are so many virtual teams now, virtual offices, they don't have to pay for these cubicles in these businesses. How does that play out then in salaries, particularly for the millennials? Are they actually reaping the benefits of the savings that companies are enjoying from everything becoming virtual?
So I think that companies are taking advantage of that, and you see a number of different companies garnering some very, very significant savings by creating these virtual environments. The fact is that virtual environments do require some investment, however.
Right.
It's investment in the infrastructure as well as end-user devices and the end-user investments as well. And so those investments need to be to play out. But I think what the millennials are going to find is that the work environment is much more is much more comfortable for them and much more in keeping with the way in which they want to work. And I think that's where the power lies.
But do companies think that they can pay their employees in comfort instead of money? I mean, is that a paradigm that we're seeing? We can pay you in these comforts, virtual and real, and not necessarily pecuniary?
I think they have to do both. And frankly, the companies that are going to be able to attract the right employees are going to do both. They're going to compensate them fairly at what the market pays, but they're also going to provide that right level of comfort for those employees, because if they can't do that, then they're going to become stale, graying organizations going forward.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. Okay,